Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having a great time at the conference. My name is Rajiv Raghunarayan, and I'm here to share with you some insights on the browser, your endpoint, why that represents such a rich attack surface, and what we can do to protect that attack surface. I've got a few stories to share with you as we go along, but more importantly, I'd like to showcase how new tools and technologies have actually made our security stronger and more seamless. But before I go forward, let me ask you two questions. The first question, how many incidents has your organization suffered in past weeks or months that originated at the end user? Now, of course, answer for yourself. But there is a general answer that we see. Do you see a pattern, especially in the Middle East region? You'll see several reports, some by companies like Proofpoint, others by PwC, all which highlight that about 4 in 5 companies have suffered a breach in the last year or so. Now, whether you're part of the 80% or part of the 20%, if you're part of the 20%, great job. If you're part of the 80%, you might want to stay on and understand why. The second question is, which of these threats is or was the most difficult to protect against? We actually posed this question to a lot of users when we had a conference here in the US back in March timeframes. And here's what they said. There's a slew of different attacks that we actually posed to them, and the distribution is fairly interesting. Understandably, a lot of users like to click on links in email, no matter how many times you tell them not to click. People tend to click, right? And it's a natural part of the process. It's curiosity, human curiosity. We tend to click on links, whether it's on websites, whether it's in email. Sometimes you'll actually see the other extreme where users are actually entering their credentials onto rogue websites. Right? And that is quite often, and you'll see some examples of that as we talk a little bit further in the presentation. And then there's attachments that people are talking about, links that they get in attachments, the links that they click everywhere. So now it's attachments, it's links, it's documents. These are pretty much the standard means by which attackers infiltrate an organization. And you'll see that the distribution quite mirrors that. Some are a little bit more prevalent than others. Now, why does that happen? It's quite natural. Our applications are starting to get more and more complex. In fact, most industries, whether you're talking about oil and gas, financial services, government, healthcare, every one of these industries is starting to digitize more and more. Right? In fact, industrialization of things is quite obvious these days. Right? Everybody is talking about it. Now, having said that, the applications also are starting to get more and more complex. Some of them are on-premise, some of them are moving to the cloud. But if you look at the actual attack surface of a typical application, you'll actually notice that the attack surface varies from the endpoint to your firewall, to an integration API, to an administration API, to a web server, to an administration tool, to the third-party integrations that you have, to the subcontractors that you bring into the end user who clicks on links. All of these represent various attack surfaces. And the challenge for any IT administrator is protecting all of these. And of course, as more and more tools and more applications start getting digitized, this is only getting more and more complex. Now, we went and analyzed the top root causes of a bunch of breaches. And we actually could categorize them into 5 key categories, or 5 key buckets. The first one, phishing and web exploits, self-explanatory, right? A phishing link that comes in an email, a web exploit that actually exploits your browser. Each of those have been responsible for some very big breaches: Target, JP Morgan Chase, DNC, or the Democratic National Congress in the US. Malware, again, a lot of threats actually deploy malware. Once they get in, once they make a home, they deploy malware to actually cause an attack or cause damage. Third-party integrations, again, Target is probably the poster child where their HVAC vendor was responsible for attacks getting in. Software configuration errors, quite obvious, quite possible, especially given the complexity and the amount of configuration that's needed for any software, any tool to work. And last but not the least, vulnerability management. It's just patching. things in real time, patching things such that you're actually safeguarded. Now, vulnerability is another interesting one. Equifax actually had a breach, but the breach happened because there was an Apache vulnerability that was exploited. So there's many such things, but the top two exploit breaches, or top two nature through which, or categories through which breaches typically tend to happen, are phishing and web and malware. Phishing, email, web exploits, and malware. Now the challenge here, of course, is the end user is the most vulnerable, the most obvious point of a breach for a lot of users or of a lot of organizations. Now, one of the key learnings is for us to take forward when we started the company. We were asking about some of these questions. The attack surface is proportional to the complexity of the applications. And that is only going to get more complex. As more and more things get digitized, more and more things move to the cloud, more and more things are connected, we are going to see more and more attack surface and more complex team defending against that. That's learning number one. Where else can we go from here? Well, let's take an example of the Garland Reach. There's a second point here to be made. Now, the Garland Reach is a very fresh or recent breach, just happened earlier this year, where Garmin actually was brought down by a ransomware, as many of you might remember. Garmin's a GPS watch manufacturer, multiple other things. You might also remember that Garmin actually does have several applications that are used by the pilots. They are FAA or the Federal Aviation approved applications that are used for navigation. And because Garmin was down with ransomware, a lot of these applications are down, including some maps and navigation equipment that were needed by pilots. So it was not just a consumer breach, it was a breach that affected people who fly planes. Now, how did this breach happen? Now, this is an interesting breach. If you go back and study this breach, you'll actually notice that the breach happened by an end user just accessing a compromised news site. Now, this compromised news site actually downloaded and installed a weaponized file onto the endpoint. Again, the mechanism here was actually something called wasted locker. Now, wasted locker is fairly new, but many of you might remember Drydex, the malware that was used quite a bit in the last 5 to 10 years. Drydex actually has been responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars of losses. It's the same authors that actually introduced Wasted Locker. And Wasted Locker was used against Garmin as one such potential company. And what really happened here is the attackers actually compromised news sites and delivered malicious advertisements or malicious updates to the endpoint via the news site. So you went to a news site through your browser. The attackers actually said your browser is outdated. Can you update your browser? Right. And as soon as you click that particular link, they actually installed a malware onto your system without the end user actually realizing. Now, of course, once they got in, it wasn't that they just went in and caused damage. They started exploring. They started moving internally to identify other systems, key systems that are responsible for either data processing, key systems that are responsible for maybe your credential management, key systems that are responsible for infrastructure and data. Now, once they moved laterally and identified the system, and to move laterally, they actually ended up using a lot of living off the land kind of attacks. They used PowerShell and the equivalent tools to actually start moving laterally. So that way, even your internal systems weren't able to identify, weren't able to detect that this is a malicious use. Now, once they were able to do that, then it was only a matter of time before they started encrypting. In fact, they went in so far as starting to encrypt users who were logged in over VPN connections. So even remote endpoints that were connected through VPN were encrypted, not just the systems and the servers. In fact, as soon as the IT folks started to figure this one out, they actually started to unplug systems. They were asking users to disconnect from VPN. Now, of course, it was too little too late in some cases, but they did save quite a bit. But on the other hand, they did lose days worth of productivity. The ransomware actually demanded about $10 million worth of ransom. Now, in this case, Garmin may have paid some, may have paid little, may have paid all of it, but we know that there was some payment potentially. And what that amount, no one knows at this particular point. But the key here is it was actually a pretty significant attack, not just for the payment part, but more importantly, how they were able to get into the system, how seamlessly they were able to get into the system, how easily they were able to navigate through the internals, and how they were able to encrypt, right? And in fact, Wasted Locker uses some pretty nifty forms of encryption. So it's not that you have freeware tools available offline to go back and decrypt those files. So it was one of those harder models to actually just recover from. So which is understandable why Garmin may have paid it, even if they did. Now, what did Wasted Locker actually do? Well, it actually downloaded a file and got the user to actually click a link. Now, a lot of times, this is as simple as getting a user to go to a website. All of us go to websites all the time, right? Whether it is for browsing purposes, whether we get an email and we click a link, or whether we get a document that actually provides us a link to go to a website. All of these aspects basically take us to the browser and through the browser to different sites or different parts of the internet. Now, of course, as more and more applications start getting cloudified, more and more apps move to the cloud, the browser becomes a critical surface that's used to access these applications, and therefore represents a very important attack surface that attackers can use to infiltrate organizations. Now, once you get into an organization, once your browser somehow is asked to go to a good site with a malicious advertisement, or maybe even take them to a malicious site, in either case, all you need to do is basically get to the site and download an exploit. Right now, what is an exploit? An exploit is basically anything that gives an attacker a foothold within your organization. In the case of a browser, it's basically some vulnerability that's exploited either within a browser or one of the add-ons within the browser or any such thing. Once the attacker gets that foothold, and these are very small pieces of code, these are not large lines of code. These are really small pieces of code that just get them a foothold. Once they have a foothold, they can download additional malware. And this is really what happened again in the case of Garmin, where that additional malware was the one that was used to move laterally, was the one that was actually used to encrypt systems. Now, again, part of the lateral movement was obviously hidden from all the, by using PowerShell and tools like that. But the idea here is once the attacker makes a foothold, they can start doing things to damage your system. And getting the foothold is as simple as you visiting a website, doing nothing more than that. Now, of course, it's very, very easy these days to get an exploit in. Now, exploits are actually getting easier. In fact, if you see the trend of exploits, there's a lot of movement in the vulnerabilities that are discovered to exploits actually starting to look more at Chrome, Safari, IE, WebKit, the tools that are used within each of these browsers. You'll actually start seeing a lot of tools that are, or a lot of exploits that are actually exploiting things like the browser. In some of these cases, the sandboxing capability of the browser. Most browsers are built with some kind of a protection layer, but there are exploits that actually have managed to bifurcate or jump across that protection layer and get into the endpoint, right? And basically take control, right? So if you look at a vulnerability here, the iframe vulnerability 8771, that basically is breaking out of the sandbox within Safari. But now couple that with something that actually allows the attacker control, like an attacker that anything that gives the attacker control to actually run any code, then the attackers immediately got control of the system. Now, why do I say this? Why is the browser so crucial? We've already discussed that. But if you actually look behind the scenes, the browser has over 9,000 different vulnerabilities. These are just the top 5 browsers, and I'm talking about Chrome, IE, Firefox, Safari, and I'm forgetting one, but Edge. Yeah, there you go. Those are the 5, but you've basically got just these browsers having 9,000 plus CVEs, and I'm not including things like WebKit or things like the JavaScript rendering engine for any of the other browsers or the likes. I'm just talking about the browsers themselves. The browsers themselves, especially given the HTML evolution over the years, has become a complex beast. It's an endpoint into itself. In fact, Chromebook's best example is completely a browser-based endpoint. And Google Chrome has 35 million lines of code. It's coded in 36 different languages. Now, that is a fairly complex piece of machinery that's running on your endpoint. And that's just one piece of machinery, but it's a complex piece that's allowing your users to access as many tools as they want to. The second side of the equation is the expertise required to actually launch an attack is shrinking. In fact, there's a Business Week article written about a year ago where an editor or where an analyst or an author actually wanted to test out how difficult is it to get a malware. Was able to go into the underground forums, get a malware as a service for $150. No more than that, $150. Actually was able to send a malware to his editor and actually infect the editor's endpoint. And again, this was done with all the parties knowing it. But it's a very interesting and thought-provoking article that actually says how easy is it to compromise an end user. All I needed was a piece of malware that was available in my forums. In fact, available with support, not just as a malware, and I could infect the endpoints. In fact, if you actually look at growth in exploit kits in 2019 as a year, there was 136% growth in exploit kits being used. The Maze, which actually uses several exploit kits, Fallout and Spillivo, was actually used in the Cognizant breach earlier in the year. GanCrab has extremely been famous, has been very famous, has used the Fallout exploit kit. Sodnokibi, which has actually evolved in the last 12 to 18 months. In fact, Sodnokibi has been used in breaches in Texas and New York Airport and other places like that. And that's actually using the rig exploit kit. Right? So you actually see exploit kits starting to evolve, exploit kits coming back in a way, especially because IE went out of fashion. Slowly people were moving away from exploit kits, but now with more applications moving to cloud, the browser taking more center stage, you're starting to see them make a comeback. Now it's easy to say that, no, why don't we catch that? Well, because evasion is also easier. All of these exploit kits actually come packaged with evasion, whether it's typo squatting. I mean, some exploit kits are actually just exploiting you typing google.com incorrectly. Now, Google's done a great job. I'll give them credit because they've actually tried to identify all of these adjacent domains and have covered that. But that doesn't mean everybody is doing that. When I go to wellsfargo.com and basically type WE11S instead of WELLS, that insignificant change is used by the attacker to actually breach your systems. And this is not just a theoretical exercise. This was exactly used for breaching Anthem a few years ago. Domain generation algorithm, where attackers are domain hopping. They're not sticking to one particular domain, so you can't just blacklist a particular domain. You can't just blacklist a particular category of sites. Fast flux, where they change the IP addresses of the domains. Right? So it may be the same domain, but if you're trying to filter on IP addresses, they keep shifting that. And on top of that, they're actually using fileless attacks to get in and move laterally, as we just discussed, living off the land. Those are absolutely the normal scheme these days. There's nothing complex about them. They're used by almost everybody, right? Except for perhaps the dumbest of attackers. Now, it's easy to say that end users are the problem, but I actually strongly believe it's not the people that are the problem. They will be the weakest link, but they are not the problem. It's extremely hard to train somebody to actually not click a link. Imagine you're a person in accounting and your job is to look at spreadsheets. Your job is to look at accounts receivable. Your job is to look at accounts payable. Your job is to actually look at the numbers. And suddenly you get an email from somebody saying, here's the new invoice. What are you going to do? Not click? You are actually not in the sales engine and you're designed to click. What if you're doing that along with 3 other things, especially in a remote work from home user? You've got a child screaming down your throat, or you've got your spouse doing something, or you've got a crappy internet connection, whatever the case be. And at that particular instant, you decide to click. How difficult is it to fool a user at that particular point in time? And that's really one of the challenges that we see, is people are not the problem. They are the weakest link, but they're not the problem. And remote working, cloud applications are only going to make this harder. So any security tool, any security solution that you select needs to solve the problem for the people. It needs to be people-centric. It can't make life harder for the people. And you can't say, no, let's increase awareness and that will make the problem go away. We've tried that for the last 10 years and the problem still stays. That's 2 lessons up there. What's the third one? Well, let's look at a slightly different breach before we get to the third one. The SingHealth breach. This actually happened in Singapore, again, another Asian country here. But SingHealth was actually an interesting breach. Before I talk about the actual how the breach happened, let's talk about what really happened. Now, Singapore is a country that has about 6 million people. The SingHealth breach actually breached one of their healthcare service providers. And in that particular breach, the attackers compromised about 1.5 million records. That's basically 25% of Singapore's population. The information that was stolen about them included their NRIC numbers, which is like the US Social Security number, your identity in a way. Right? They stole their email addresses, their date of birth, their names, full names, whatnot. Now, this could actually be used to create a new identity. Right? And that's pretty significant. But that breach affected about 25% of Singapore's population back in 2018, not too long ago. And this actually started in 2017, was an initial breach of an employee workstation via a phishing attack in August of 2017, was not detected. What the attackers do? What they almost always do. They started moving laterally, identifying, capturing password at each stage to identify what else they could reach till they got to the right system. They made repeated accesses to gain the database information, to gain the backend information, including testing the systems, finding other vulnerabilities, and breaking in. Someone in IHIS actually noticed this unauthorized database access, but they actually did not terminate it at that particular point in time. Again, imagine the situation. You've got so many things coming up on your console, and you missed this one, right? Or you missed acting on this one. Now, unfortunately, it was July 4th before they actually terminated access, and the attackers had started stealing information around June 27th. So they had a full week worth of information that was stolen. And again, by the time the senior management was notified, it was yet another few days before that actually happened. So by the time the actual action was taken, the attackers had been in for almost a year. They'd started stealing information, they started moving laterally, they started exfiltrating data before anybody could take an action. And again, this is not unheard of. There's lots of breaches that have happened exactly like this. SingHealth just represents one of those instances where this unfortunately caused significant damage. Now, in the case of SingHealth, right, one of the questions that we could ask is, why wasn't your solution able to detect and respond? Right? The challenge is when you rely on detection and response, there's two big questions that you need to answer. First is, how quickly can we detect a breach? In this particular case, did I detect the breach in August of 2017? Or did I detect it only in 2018, June, July of 2018? Right? In this particular case, it almost took a year. In fact, the average time to detect a breach is anywhere between 3 months to 6 months to 8 months, depending on which report you follow. Right? But the smallest number is about 3 months, about 100 days. That hasn't shrunk too much. It had shrunk quite a bit from about 7 to 8 months down to 3 months, according to certain reports, but it has not come down below that. The second big question is, how fast can we respond? How deep is the breach is the next question, because the response depends on the depth of the breach. If one machine is compromised, my response could be fairly swift. But if my attacker compromises one machine and then the second and the third and the fourth and the 10th, and then moves laterally into my systems, compromising the database credentials, how quickly can I respond? Because the cost of the breach and the complexity of response are a function of which stage of protection you're in. If the attackers have moved deeper, stage 6, internal reconnaissance, lateral movement, exfiltration, it is very expensive. It is not in a timely fashion. In fact, that's one of the challenges that our industry is suffering from, is the time to respond, the time to detect, what we call dwell time, is fairly large. What about a reverse strategy? What if I put policies that people don't have access? Well, it's possible, and a lot of organizations do this. The biggest challenge that I've heard when I'm spoken to CIOs and compliance officers is, how does it impact the business? I actually do need access to cloud-based services. I do need to research my competition. I do need to research the market. I do need to research the price of commodities, the price of oil, the price of something else. I do need to research. How do I keep up with changing business needs? Well, in one organization, financial organization that I've specifically spoken to, the request went all the way to the chief compliance officer if I needed to access some website. The CCO would then approve that request. For 24 hours, you'd have access to a website. And then, of course, the cycle would repeat. If you need more access, go back, gets approved. But you can imagine the productivity impact of doing this continuously. And that was really one of the challenges of policy-based security that I've heard from a lot of customers. Is it's great, it does solve the broad-based attacks, but it does impede business. So how do I get past this? And that is really one of the biggest crux of the problem is how do I keep my security nimble? How do I keep my administrators nimble? And of course, every one of you is aware of this. I don't even need to speak to this. One of the biggest challenges that we currently face is shortage of security staff, shortage of skilled audience, skilled security folks. And again, this is the newest report by ESG. They've been doing this study for the last 4 or 5 years. And they actually speak to the primary ramifications of that increased workload on existing staff. Is basically hiring and training junior workers to do the job of senior professionals. That's exactly what happened in the case of IHIS. They actually had 2 professionals who had not done this as a career and were pretty new into the responsibility, and they were actually overseeing or managing this. They did not know to differentiate alert A versus alert B. And that you cannot blame the audience or the administrator for that. And it's kind of ironic because these are people who need to get trained, but they just don't have the time to get trained. And they're working 24 hours a day when you're working 24 hours a day. And that's the third key learning that I take away from talking to customers is skills gap will continue to grow. This is here to stay. So any solution that you look to adapt, that we look to adopt, needs to address this problem. So again, to reiterate, solutions will get more complex, therefore attack surface will get more and more complex. People will continue to click on links. People will continue to open emails, open attachments, and your administrators are never going to be complete. You always will be short of staff. So what do we do in light of these 3 problems? And that is where we strongly believe that we need to rethink the way we approach cybersecurity. And this is where we think zero trust is actually a very good pursuit, a very strong pursuit. Now, zero trust has been around for a while, and I will also say there is no true thing as zero trust. It is what we call implicit versus explicit trust. Historically, we've had implicit trust. You are connected to my network, therefore I trust you. Zero trust moves from that trust but verify model, which we've historically had, and moves us to more of a, I will verify at every point in time. I will not implicitly trust. I will force you to explicitly validate or authenticate or protect. Now, zero trust can be implemented through several different technologies, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the whole notion of zero trust is to assume that there will be a breach, and how do we respond to that breach? How do we shrink the attack surface? How do we shorten the dwell time? And that's really the focus of zero trust. Now, there are several technologies that actually go under the name zero trust. Zero trust is a philosophy. It is not a tool, it's not a technology. Anybody telling you that is giving a lot of bogus arguments. Now, zero trust can be implemented in several different layers, and you probably are aware of some of these layers. Now, I'll start from the right, the network. Right? We all have cloud applications or some form of applications that are running in my data center or in the cloud. Now, it is logical to think that each of these applications are fairly independent and therefore segment them. Right? Now, microsegmentation is a well understood phenomenon. Now, this would have actually stopped something like the Target breach, which happened back in 2013 in the US, right? Where you actually were able to jump off your HVAC network into your secure cash transaction network. That's one. The second one is zero trust network access. Zero trust network access actually has taken a lot of mindshare in the recent times, again, because a lot of people have gone remote. But what does ZTNA do? ZTNA actually controls what service you can access, what rights do you have, what services do you have visibility to. Just because you're on the network doesn't mean you need to be able to see every service that's on the network. It forces you to authenticate and identify yourself before it exposes a service to you and provides the appropriate level of control. ZTNA is a fairly new concept as well, but again, it's interesting because it provides that access layer of zero trust. The third layer that we are talking about today is remote browser isolation, which actually focuses on the user. Again, we spoke about the user being one of the weakest links, people being one of the weakest links. RBI, or remote browser isolation, focuses on protecting the user from the internet. Instead of trusting the internet implicitly and allowing anything and everything to execute on your end system coming from an untrusted, unknown network, why not find a way to actually protect and safeguard against that? And it basically starts with a slightly different question. Can I allow access to the internet, to my assets, to whatever, to my end users, but actually stop the threat from getting back to the end user? Could I provide like a one-way transaction mechanism, which allows my user to access the internet, but the internet cannot access me? And that really was the question where RBI started with. If you go back, if I allow things to execute, then I have to protect. If I don't allow things to execute, then I have a policy-based system, but I have to compete for the user's mindshare, the user's productivity. But what if I could balance the two? What if I could provide access, but do not allow things to execute? And that's really the question that we started with. So how does RBI work? So what remote browser isolation does is it moves trust away from the endpoint, away from your local browser, and essentially takes the entire execution of the website into a remote browser, into a remote disposable container. Right? It executes the entire web page. It fetches the web page, executes the active elements, and renders the page remotely. Right? And then streams harmless pixels down to your endpoint. So how does this work? Let's just take the workflow out here and see that. So let's say you're the user. Go into your computer, type www.google.com, and that request goes to a website. And that website brings down a lot of HTML code, JavaScript code. It could be a Flash file or anything else. And that executes on your local system today. What would happen with remote browser isolation is we've moved that trust away from the endpoint. We actually introduced almost like a protective layer around each endpoint. And for every request that's sent to the internet, so when you go to google.com, it's not you who's going to google.com. It's actually a remote browser going on your behalf, fetching the page, executing all the active elements, and rendering the page remotely. And what you get is basically a pixel streamed version onto your endpoint. So I'm using ISLA, which is the Cyberinc version of remote browser isolation. The term is ISLA. ISLA moves the trust away from the endpoint and transforms all the HTML code that comes from the internet into a stream of visual pixels. As far as you are interacting, it is nothing but a stream of visual pixels. It's a virtual interaction, not an actual one. But there is no change to the end user experience. Essentially, the end user behaves exactly as they would. They would open up their Firefox. They would open up their Chrome. They would open up their IE, whatever browser they're using, go in and type www.google.com, and ISLA acts as a proxy, captures the traffic, and sends it off to the remote browser, and essentially gets the remote browser to do the work on your behalf. Basically, it safeguards your end user from actually having to execute anything locally. Now, of course, the next immediate question is, so what threats does it stop? Well, logically, any threat that would actually execute on the endpoint, that would actually try to compromise the endpoint. And how does it do that? Well, think of something like a ransomware, which is trying to download malicious code, which is trying to download and exploit, compromise the browser. What if I do not give it access to the browser? What if it was executing in a remote disposable browser? I finished my execution, disposed of the browser, nothing touched my endpoint. Well, the ransomware didn't even come into my endpoint to actually cause a damage. Similarly, email phishing attacks, credential theft attacks. We'll talk about each one of these, and instead of talking, we'll actually give you a demo, document security and web security. How do each of these work? Let's come back to that. But first, let's look at a few demo slides here. So let's actually play this out. What happens when I go in as an end user? So let's start with the end user first. So the end user goes in, types www.google.com, and look at the user experience there. I need to authenticate once and once only, so that I have a context of that particular user. This could even be tied into your Active Directory, but you just look at it as a remote browser that's actually rendering google.com, except for the star on top. The star is an indication that this page has been rendered isolated. How do you also tell that? Well, open the source code. You'll actually see none of the source actually comes from google.com. It's nothing but a pixel stream being rendered on your local browser. The actual execution is running remotely. You can open Yahoo, like a news site. You can go to a media site like YouTube, or you could go to a news site like Wall Street Journal, whatever, your local site, your local variant, right? And Isla would actually execute all the code remotely and render it as a pixel stream. Click a link, open in a new tab, and basically that opens up as an isolated session. Your user's actually not downloading anything. Now, what about email? A lot of us actually use email on a day-to-day basis, personal email too. Well, go into mail.google.com. And again, you can actually open up the entire mail.google.com as a remote isolated session. You open an email, click a link, that link opens up as an isolated session. So nothing's really executing on your endpoint at this particular point in time. What if the email actually was a malicious email that was trying to compromise your credentials, like I got one from Bank of America here, as an example? Well, Isla identifies that site as suspicious and renders that as read-only. So even if I want to enter my credentials, I cannot. It is rendering the page as read-only. Of course, I could disable that, but that's admin controlled. In this particular case, I have the control, therefore I did. But in most cases, the admin did not get the control, except to certain users that they trust. Now, this was email. You got web. What about documents? Well, we actually interact with drive.google.com, Dropbox, Box. What if I actually got a document from anywhere that actually was malicious? Well, Isla does three things. There's policy-based control. There's remote rendering. As you're seeing here, we convert a doc file to a PDF file. And then there's malware scanning. Now, as I download this document, I could download the PDF file as is, and therefore nothing compromises my end system. Or I could download the original. And in either case, Isla will scan the file for malware before it's downloaded. And of course, if it's malicious, we'll actually stop it. So let's take a case in point of a malicious file. I went to Palo Alto Networks, tested a malware file. There's a PE sample there. Let's click the PE sample here. And as soon as I try to open the PE file, we run a malware scanner. And that malware scanner will basically identify this as a malicious file and stop the file from being downloaded. In this particular case, again, that's the end user experience when I talk about the end user actually downloading the file and interacting with the file, interacting with the web page, interacting with an email, interacting with documents. That's what the end user experience looks like. What about the admin experience? What does the admin see? Well, let's look at that next. So the administrator will always see the latest threats in the security dashboard. So there is a dashboard that will say where the threats came from, who are the highest risk users, what threats happened over time for each user, which source URL, what was the threat score, what files were downloaded, were they malicious files, how many malicious files by which user, and how many non-malicious files. You obviously are not storing the file here, but you get an idea of what the files are, what the threats are. And you get an overall user threat metric of websites visited, files downloaded, and the likes. Now, of course, I can manage users via LDAP, or I can manage users locally. I can associate policies at the user level, at the user group level, or at the organization level. I can do third-party integrations, whether it's identity providers like LDAP, SIM integration, sandbox integration, all of those will work. And each of these policies, again, going into the detail of these policies, will actually contain more information about file uploads, file downloads, what file types can I upload, what file types can I download, what kind of scanning do I need to do, whether it's sandbox scanning or AV scanning or whatever else. We can set up trusted sites to say these sites I trust, don't isolate them. Or I can set up policies to say these categories need to be blocked. I do not want certain sites or certain categories of sites to be accessed, like social media. For instance, I say, you know what, I don't want to allow users to go to social media. I can actually control that particular access. So even if I go to facebook.com, I can actually block that with simple administrative policy. So that is also possible. And all of this information is also available as reports to your administrator, to you. You can pull a report on security threats that were stopped for a particular window of time. You can pull a report on the browsing activity, which sites did users visit, and when did they visit that site? What kind of rendering was done for that particular site? So you actually get a list of user behavior at your disposal. So again, what kind of risks are people introducing? Are people going to isolated sites? Which browsers are they using? Are they going to read-only sites? That means the higher risk activity by a particular user. And you can download this information as a PDF file, as an HTML file, as a CSV file, and as an Excel file. And as soon as you download it, of course, you can integrate that with any third-party system. So again, the key here is the administrator gets the visibility, gets the control about their organization, their users, whether the users are local or remote, doesn't matter. And that really is what ISLA offers to the administrator. They can control file policies, upload policies, download policies, copy paste, what can be allowed, what cannot be allowed, scanning policies. It can be a policy that's at a user level, at a user group level, at an organization level. So again, ISLA offers protection against various classes of threats, just to summarize. So if I had ransomware or a cryptojacking attack, ISLA can absolutely safeguard the first stage of that threat coming in. Email phishing, email links, I click the link, it's opening up as in an isolated environment. If an email is trying to steal my credentials, well, I identify that through certain algorithms, including machine learning algorithms that are running in the cloud in a service called Cyberinc Threat Intelligence, and render the site as a read-only site so users don't get to enter the credentials into a malicious site. Document security, we can scan documents, we remotely render documents, we allow administrators the control of whether they want documents downloaded to be allowed or not allowed. And web security, obviously you're controlling the actual website rendering and rendering it remotely, so you don't necessarily let the threats come in. Not only that, you can actually control category-based blocking as well. So malvertising threats, URL filtering, all of those capabilities are actually packaged into ISLA. Now, a lot of customers obviously ask the question of the deployment options, and ISLA offers several. In fact, a lot of vendors within the space offer different deployment options. Some are within the cloud only, some are on-premise only. What we've chosen a path is to provide that distinction. We've got an on-premise physical deployment, an on-premise virtual appliance that you can deploy within your VMware, Hyper-V kind of environments, or for that matter, you can get a cloud service, a cloud-based hosted service, where we offer ISLA as a service. So there's different deployment options with points of presence at multiple locations across the globe. So no matter where the users are, you can actually choose the appropriate deployment. And of course, you can have a hybrid deployment as well. And that's really the power of having that user experience and security control together. Not to mention, you actually saw the user experience. It's fairly straightforward. From the end user's perspective, they're still using the browser exactly as they did, except they have a proxy that's actually catching the traffic and isolating the users based on their requests. Now, email and web security as a whole is pretty crucial. In fact, if you look at the critical security controls that have been posted, email and web security actually made their appearance into this particular control set as well, especially about supporting the right types of browsers, not allowing plugins, limiting the scripting capabilities, subscribing or managing the URL filtering capability, blocking unnecessary file types. All of these are mechanisms through which threats have actually entered the system. And if you look at the different implementation groups, RBI can actually support a lot of these use cases. Remote browser isolation can support a lot of these use cases for the end users, for the organizations. Now, of course, there's multiple ways that if you start looking at remote browser isolation solutions, there's multiple things that you will see. Different vendors will quote different things. Now, what I'd like to share here is how do you evaluate these solutions? What should you look for? First and foremost, I think almost every customer that I talk to has this. What's the user experience for the solution? Get a feel for that, because not every solution is alike. You will actually see some solutions will bring their own browser. They will not support standard browsers. Yet others will actually have a browser and browser. So you actually have the original site on top, but then you will have the isolated site within, and the users need to know which one is isolated, which one is not. So the user experience isn't always nifty. Look for solutions that offer seamless user experience. The user should not see anything, should not feel anything. Second one, what threats are covered? There are several threats: email-based threats, phishing links, website visits, category-based blocking, document-based threats. If you actually look at the different threat categories, you actually see that browser isolation by itself doesn't cover everything. So does the solution actually provide a broad application? How do they protect against credential theft attacks? What kind of browser isolation do they provide? What level of browser isolation do they provide? Those are all different threats. Some browser isolation solutions do not cover CSS-based attacks, do not cover media-based attacks. Does the solution actually cover that? What about the deployment models? Some organizations that I've spoken to absolutely swear by on-premise even today. Others are absolutely open to the cloud, yet others want that mixed deployment, the hybrid deployment, just to balance user experience in different regions and privacy in other regions. So it's always a mixed bag. Are the deployment models offered by the vendors aligned with your business goals? What level of administrative visibility and control do you have? Do you have to pay more to procure additional components? There's always a nickel and dime. There are vendors who will sell you the base, then add a little bit more, add a little bit more, and add a little bit more. The question is how much nickel and diming is there? And what level of control does your administrator have? Do they have to pay more for that? It's important because every solution is not alike. Some people would like to bring in their proxy and the visibility and control becomes part of their proxy, right? So you buy browser isolation, but also buy my proxy. That will give you visibility and control. And last but not the least, you've already got security investments in there. You've got a proxy, you've got a sandbox, you've got other tools. How does your browser isolation solution integrate with your existing investments? Does it or does it not? And that's an important component for you to assess. In fact, we actually worked with an organization here, SANS, a very reputed organization globally. We worked with SANS to actually put together a buyer's guide. So anyone actually looking at isolation solutions, definitely go download the buyer's guide. We've actually hosted this on Cyberinc.com. You can also get it on SANS's website. Last but not the least, let me summarize what we were talking about. The first and foremost, I want to capture 3 points here. The first point, understand your attack surface. What are the applications your end users are using? What sites, what are the risks, where are the risks coming from? Not every business is alike. And I'm not going to say browser isolation solves all problems. There are some problems that are obviously not solved by browser isolation, and you may need other solutions for doing that. But where are your risks from? Is the user one of the key components of your risk? Then understand that particular risk for you or for your industry. Second, your approach to zero trust is not going to be uniform. There are lots of zero trust vendors. There is no one solution to zero trust. Understand where's your risk. Is it the user? Is it the access? Is it the network? You could start at any particular point and you could move laterally in terms of adopting other solutions. As users move to the cloud, as your applications are moving to the cloud, as connectivity is everywhere, users are moving everywhere, does the solution actually cater to that? What is the zero trust solution that you need to protect for that particular business move? And last but not the least, end user security actually can be done with zero trust. There are lots of tools and technologies out there, but especially as people move more to SaaS, the browser becomes an important attack surface. Just understand that, right? It's okay if you don't buy browser isolation, but do understand that aspect. Focus on optimizing any solution for that end user experience. Blocking does not always work. Detection and response probably puts more administrative overhead than is necessary. Find that right balance. And last but not the least, more isn't always better. I've seen a lot of organizations that spend millions of dollars on their cybersecurity, but there probably are different types of tools that do the same type of function. More of the same is not necessarily doing different. So think about where your investment goes. Think about what role zero trust has to play within your organization and within your security controls. And if you'd like to learn more, we absolutely have more tools online, and you can obviously visit our booth as well. But do come online. We've got capabilities where you can learn about browser isolation. You can actually see the demo. It's a short demo, or you can talk to us live. We've got sales reps waiting at the booth. We got sales rep waiting online, even if you're looking at it after the fact. You can absolutely reach us. And of course, last but not the least, if any one of you is evaluating, interested, wants to try browser isolation, we do have a 90-day trial that's going on. We'd love for you to try it out. We'd love for you to see the benefit. Lots of organizations are benefiting from it. We'd love for you to have one of those, for you to be one of those as well. Thank you, and have a great rest of the conference. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.